Hi, my name's Alex. I'm here with Shavin, my friend and fellow philosopher, if we can call each other that. And yeah, I guess a little bit about me before we start talking, and also about Shavin. Recently, as in literally 3 hours ago, I'm a graduate philosophy student, which is pretty cool. And relevant for this talk, I guess. And I guess in my time, I read some philosophy, play guitar, and record a podcast called Aleks Listens, which you should check out. And that's all that you need to know about me. There's not much more that's important. And Shavin, what about you?
Hey, as Alex said, I'm Shavin. I did a little bit of philosophy as well. I don't know if I'd go to the length that Alex did and call myself a philosopher, but maybe a student of, at least. I don't know, my day-to-day is I work in the aged care industry, which is maybe not where typical philosophy students would end up. But
where they get employment.
Yeah, but no, it's awesome. I really like it there, and I think philosophy probably gave me more skills than any of the other degrees that I ever did in tackling the world around us, and understanding why things are maybe the way they are, and why I like to participate in some of those things. So yeah, pretty interested and excited to get into this and see what comes out of it.
And before we begin, just a quick acknowledgement of country. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. Okay, so I guess the talk is going to have a particular structure because we figured that would be the best way to talk about the stuff that we want to talk about, because some of it is really abstract and theoretical, and then some of it is more grounded in personal experience and is related to real-world examples, and then some of it is kind of anticipatory and speculative about the future and how the philosophy that we're going to talk about is related to the future. So I guess I'll briefly outline the talk, and there'll be 3 slides which kind of designate the 3 different sections of the talk, which will be helpful for us and hopefully helpful for you too. The first part of the talk, I will expound upon this philosophical idea called bad faith, which is by a French existentialist philosopher called, in French, Jean-Paul Sartre, and in, I guess, Anglophone English, Jean-Paul Sartre. We'll stick with the Anglophone title because it's easier to say. And his theory is very relevant for discussing growth and kind of sets a firm foundation for us to talk about growth and related things. So that's going to be the first part of the talk. Then we'll move on to that philosophical theory in the real world. And then finally, we'll move on to what comes after this theory and how we can kind of embed it in our lives and whether it's actually a helpful way of thinking about the world. So yeah, I guess part 1, bad faith. Okay, so bad faith is a theory about authenticity, I guess. And it's kind of hard to pin down because there are no clear examples of, in writing the theory, the philosopher Sartre doesn't have any clear examples of what it doesn't look like. He only tells us what living in bad faith does look like, which is kind of frustrating because that we only ever receive an image of what we shouldn't do. We never receive an image of what we should do. So what is it that we shouldn't do? What exactly is bad faith? Well, it's a theory about freedom, kind of intellectual freedom about decision-making and purpose and navigating the world, which is born from the acceptance of this thing that the existentialist philosophers thought that we had, which is this kind of really radical freedom of thought and of movement through the world. And I guess some of them, including Sartre, believed that we are so free that at any point we can kind of change the direction of our life if we so wish. And that's where bad faith comes into this, because I guess when we live in bad faith, we are stifling and suppressing this like humongous intellectual decision-making freedom that we have. And therefore, we should try and, if we want to live not in bad faith, and I say not in bad faith as opposed to in good faith, because again, it's really hard to, the philosopher doesn't give us clear examples of what good faith is, or if we can actually call it good faith. But yeah, we're supposed to not live in bad faith by accepting this freedom and kind of getting into, or harnessing that when we're making decisions. So yeah, I'm going to give you 2 examples of what bad faith looks like, and then we're going to move into the second section. So the first famous example is of a waiter. And the waiter wakes up in the morning and they, the alarm goes off. They've anticipated the alarm. They're very ready for work. They kind of bounce out of bed. They advance in a calculated way around their apartment. They dress themselves very carefully, and they're priming themselves for this employment that, while they respect, they want to abandon because, their passion is elsewhere. They're an artist, or they want to travel or something. And at work, the waiter is extremely obsequious. They're really subservient. They're extremely enthusiastic about serving people. And there is too much commitment to their employment and not enough commitment to their freedom to be free from their employment or to kind of change their circumstances. And so that's one example of being in bad faith, which Sartre provides us with. The second example is of a friend of ours who is on a date. And the date's going well, the food was nice, the conversation's good, whatever. And there is uncertainty about whether there's actually any kind of romantic compatibility here. Our friend doesn't know whether there is interest. There's like no way of detecting the signaling, whether they're interested in each other. And then there comes a point, the date kind of reaches its crescendo when the person that our friend is on the date with places their hand on our friend's hand, and our friend doesn't act. And in this moment, we view bad faith very clearly, because by having the hand placed on their hand, they're being pulled into this moment of decision making. They either have to, commit to the hand interaction thing and squeeze back, or retract their hand or something in order to signal whether or not, they're interested in the person or interested in what the hand might represent. And by doing nothing and by just kind of leaving their hand there without committing to any of the circumstances that may eventuate, they're acting in bad faith. So that is another example of acting in bad faith. So really, bad faith is a claim about actually embracing our capacity to change our circumstances. And I'm going to leave the analysis of the theory there, because that's probably enough of a theoretical basis for us to actually move on to the discussion, which is going to be the remainder of the talk. So let's move on to the second part, which is bad faith and the real world. So Shav, how did you feel about that? What do you make of bad faith?
Yeah, I think also I don't know if it was clear, but just so, in case anyone was, wondering while you're watching, I think the thing with the waiter as well is that Sartre would say that he's actually, in a sense, lying to himself as well. And he'll have these moments in his life, maybe at nighttime or maybe while he's in the shower, these sort of harrowing moments where he realizes that the thing that he's doing right now is not the thing that he wants to do or wants to be doing. And I think that's really important because he's not feeling this way just because he's a waiter, but because there's something else that he wants to, or there could be something else that he could be, but he's almost lying to himself and saying that he can't be those things. So, when I look at it in that lens, it seems like a really interesting and attractive, almost, philosophy. It makes you feel like, I can be in complete control, or, I have this complete freedom of what I want to do or who I want to be. But in practice, I'm not sure that it's so easy to feel that way, or perhaps feel comfortable in acting upon that freedom, whether it exists or not.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of where we were hoping to begin our discussion of this, because I guess one really important question to ask about bad faith is whether it actually reflects anyone's experience. Like, sure, many times I will have been frustrated with my life and I will have wanted to kind of uproot myself and move on to something different. And I guess that would be living not in bad faith, because I would be kind of, analyzing the horizon of opportunities that are before me and then moving on to something else and moving on consciously, deciding that there is something else that I want to do. But, while that may constitute a form of growth or something, because there is a conscious decision to change one's circumstances, it doesn't really seem practical. Because if someone was to constantly live in bad faith, for example, their life would be wild. They would be like constantly changing their circumstances, being really whimsical and spontaneous. And like, who's to say that, I guess it's hard to moralize the claim of bad faith and place a value judgment on whether it's good or bad to live in such a way. So I guess, Shav, like, do you think there is a clear divide between... Do you think it's possible to moralize bad faith? Do you think it is clearly a good claim, or a good way to live in bad faith, or do you think it is clearly a bad way to live in bad faith?
I think it's really hard, I think, to moralize, because it seems as though the experience of living in bad faith or not is purely subjective. And by trying to moralize it, it almost means that we need to try put some sort of objective lens on it. And how can I know for you what it is that you live, what the things are that you do in bad faith, and how can, in turn, how could you ever know what things I would be doing in bad faith or not? So, and to treat it as a stout moral perspective seems tricky to me as well, because there are very real, objective factors of the world which help or hinder, seemingly, our ability to choose to live in bad faith or not. So his claim seems to me this very subjective experience. A crude example could be that, you have someone in a room, sitting in a room. He or she or they do what some people might look at and say, oh, they do nothing with their lives, but sit in that room.
As in, like, they're not doing anything.
Yeah, they just sit
like
there.
Okay, literally sitting
literally
there.
just sit there. Maybe eat some food, drink some water, go to the bathroom, but just live in that room and do nothing. And, you know, under bad faith, there could be a way for him or for them to live in not bad faith in that example. But I think the way that the world views us and the way that we often view ourselves within the world and our growth within the world is through these objective lenses that seem to impede our ability to live or not live in bad faith, or at least make a judgment on whether we are or are not living in bad faith, whether we make that or not.
Yeah, right. And yeah, I guess an interesting thing about the objective versus subjective guides that we receive in terms of, you know, how we should behave or something, whether or not we're doing the right thing. I guess, you know, maybe it'd be helpful to list some of them. So I guess one very clear force that I've felt in my life has been that I should go to university and get, like, you know, a tertiary education. And in some ways, there was very little choice that I felt I had when making the decision to go to uni. It just kind of happened, right? And I guess that, for me, upon reflection, that feels like a really clear example of acting in bad faith, because I just, like, ended up at uni. There was no real choice, conscious choice, maybe between the courses, but even then, like, you know, I guess one thing that both you and I have in common is that we come from migrant families. And I guess by virtue of coming from a migrant family, there isn't, like, you know, you and I are both, either 0 Gen or Gen 1, like, Australians. We haven't been here for very long. And so there isn't, like, the foundation that kind of grants us, that might grant us freedom if, if, you know, like, we had an established family or something. And so, yeah, I guess bringing this back to the objective versus subjective things, I feel like I've been fed loads of objective ways of determining growth. Education, income, maybe those are the two biggest ones that I've felt. Education, income, and then maybe employment. And I guess there is a lot of freedom to kind of navigate between them, but still there is, like, this really heavy, with those three things being, like, the main three things that I feel like I've been socialized to move towards, that really cuts out a lot of different stuff. There's, like, a real kind of stamping or clamping down on, like, my freedom to do other things. Like, who knows, maybe I could have been, like, an artist or something. But yeah, I'm just, like, a broke philosophy student. Yeah, and an interesting thing that we were talking about in preparation for this talk was the way that objective definitions of growth, like, I don't know, getting a job at Goldman Sachs or something, can kind of bleed into subjective definitions of growth. Like, what does it mean if it turns out that you actually really enjoy the thing that you've kind of been forced into doing? Yeah, so I don't know, how do you feel about all that? Like, do you think there is a very clear line between subjective and objective definitions of growth? Or, like, yeah, do you like, how do you feel in your life? Do you feel like you've been able to clearly separate them?
Probably not as clear as I'd maybe hope to be able to separate them. And I think when I think about my family, right? So we came here, I think maybe 17 years ago now. So when I was 7. So when we came here, and when my mum came here, she came here before all of us. And she had very clear objective goals that she needed to meet in order for us to for her to gain employment here, for her to have a roof to house us under, to pay for our food, to put us at school. You know, there are these very clear guidelines on what she had to do. And from what I understand from what she has told me, she was quite happy in those moments doing the things that were prescribed. You know, the government will say, you know, if you want to get your citizenship, you've got to be here. And at that time, it was 3 years. And, you know, be an accountant, you know, there's a restriction on the kind of job or the kind of career that you're allowed to pursue. So mum wasn't allowed to go become a graphic designer, for example, because if she changed her career, she would have to go back to Sri Lanka or Dubai, where we came from. So, you know, and to think that she gained no subjective growth or didn't have an enjoyable, at least in some sense, get something out of that in a subjective sense, I think seems to me a bit short-sighted. And I think it makes that line really, really blurry.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, and that kind of links back to the example that you gave of the person sitting in the room doing what from the outside looks like very little. And how, like, yeah, it seems like we have been taught to be very quick in our judgment of how people relate to their circumstances and how people choose to navigate them. And I think you're right. Like, my grandparents, for example, when they migrated to Australia from Macedonia in the mid-60s, they came here because, you know, it's a land of opportunity, blah, 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 better standard of life. Presumably not for them, though. I don't imagine it was, I guess, partly for them, but, you know, it's for the generations to come. And they worked in factories, both of them. And, yeah, I guess I wonder whether... See, this is where bad faith is a really unhelpful way of thinking about whether someone is, like, actually living as they should. Because imagine the consequences if, like, my migrant grandparents who, like, weren't established at all, lived by this philosophy and were just, like, uprooting themselves all the time, quitting their, like, factory jobs, being like, you know what, like, I want to be a painter, I want to be a sculptor. That comes with a huge sacrifice and a huge risk. And while, you know, it might be, like, personally fulfilling because you get to do this thing that you find meaningful with more of your time, I guess it has huge existential consequences because, I don't know, you can't provide for your family and you have young dependent children. And, like, yeah, you know, that kind of, it conflicts with your reasons for moving to Australia because you're moving there for prosperity, not, like, sculpting. So, yeah, I think that's one way that we can, like, that one thing that's important to recognize about bad faith, that it doesn't really account for, it seems to be an ultra-privileged interpretation of meaning and what's meaningful, because it seems to link meaningfulness with the freedom to change one's circumstances. And I guess the freedom to change your circumstances, like, seems to be presupposed by a certain degree of, like, financial stability or something. Or if it's not, then I guess the risk just increases the less and less financial stability you have. So, yeah, I don't know. What do you think about that criticism?
Yeah, I think it's almost as if when you've got something to lose, and I don't mean lose. I actually had this conversation with a friend yesterday, and, you know, they were like, oh, but, you know, what if, you know, someone, you know, who's got a few million takes out, I don't know, $15,000 loan to put on the stock market. I don't mean, you know, something to lose in that sort of sense, or in such a general sense. Like, it's quite specifically, something to lose that if you lost it, it would lead to one of those existential crises that Aleks was speaking about, right? It would lead to losing the home that you are that you have to shelter your young family. It could mean, not having the money to put food on the table. And it seems as though, if we take bad faith to be this principle, the ability to act out this principle seems to diminish based on what the consequence of losing the things that you have to lose are. And to say to someone that, their life is, I guess, not a meaningful one, or it's not purposeful because they're not able to perhaps live not in bad faith in the way that Sartre posits it, is tricky. And intuitively, it seems almost wrong. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where my gripe, I guess, with bad faith really comes into play, because it seems like a really nice ideal. And it makes you feel good. Like, when I think about it, like, it makes me feel awesome, right? Like, I've got this ability to change whatever I want. But practically, when I look at the real world, when we look at how, you need capital to do things, it means that there are certain ways in which you need to engage with the world. And if you opt to only not live in bad faith, unless of course, your not living in bad faith is in sync with what the world needs, or with what,
the objective measures
with
of you.
Yeah, like if you are if you're an investment banker, right, and you love it, right, you love
the ultimate immoral
no, like
form of employment.
You love making money. You love making other people money. Like, that's the idea. You love making deals. You love it. It's hard to think that person is living in bad faith, right? But they're in a fortunate position where, for them, not living in bad faith helps them in a really advantageous way.
And it also overlaps with, or reflects objective measures of growth.
Absolutely.
Like elite, presumably to work at Goldman Sachs, you need a really, expansive and expensive education. And and presumably if you work at Goldman Sachs, you're going to get paid a lot as well. And those are two things that we're taught to value, employment and education. And that's a really interesting, example where, because I guess the gut reflex is that it's problematic for someone to really enjoy, for someone to be really enthusiastic about money. There feels like some kind of, at least for me, I'm not sure why, but some kind of alarm bells ring when I hear that someone is, and I think it is because I've been really heavily influenced by existential philosophers. And when I feel like someone is extremely passionate about most things, I kind of wonder whether that is itself a form of bad faith, because they're failing to acknowledge, or they're failing to diversify their life a bit. And I guess I place value on spontaneity and creativity and things. But yeah, maybe that's a really baseless and unfair claim that I should try and drop. But yeah, I think I'm really interested by that. What happens, what we should say about the person whose subjective understanding of growth overlaps with objective standards of growth. Because I wonder what Sartre would say. I wonder whether he would actually endorse that position. And I guess like a literal interpretation of bad faith would suggest that the person who does, I think, yeah, what's important in bad faith is consciously deciding to do the things that you do. And I think this is why there isn't a clear moral framework that follows bad faith or that's associated with bad faith, because I guess the moral part of it is whether or not you are consciously deciding to do what you do. And yeah, that, I don't know. It's really strange, because then we should, what if there's someone who's extremely altruistic, like someone who, I don't know, like Naomi Milgram, who funds M Pavilion, or whose foundation funds M Pavilion. What if it just happens that someone who is charitable ends up being charitable by accident? Like, what if it isn't a conscious decision? Then do we say that they're, like, what does it mean to act in bad faith if you're acting in bad faith with like these really important social consequences that like allow talks to happen and allow like people to learn new stuff? So yeah, I think that's, I don't know. Do you actually think it's bad to live in bad faith? I guess that's the question. That like, yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this is I think the bigger problem with bad faith for me, is that there are moments in which, or periods for which, you can live in bad faith, but it ends up, resulting in a good thing, or, what society might deem a good thing. And I think what it shows to me is that it seems as though bad faith alone is not enough to encapsulate or describe the way in which we should live in the world. But also, we said at the start that the way that he posits it is that it's how not to live. But I don't think it even tells me enough about how not to live as well. Because, if this was all done by accident, then what we would be saying is that this shouldn't happen at all. And, that to me seems like we're taking something meaningful or purposeful away from the world. And not just our talk, but like, I don't know if our talk will be purposeful, meaningful to you guys or not, but, all the other things that M Pavilion does. And I know, there are, I have an architect friend who absolutely loves M Pavilion and the things that they provide for them. So, yeah, I think the claim comes unstuck, even though it seems so simple at the start.
Comes unstuck how?
Because it seems as though there are things that we could do in bad faith.
Yeah, which are good things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which we maybe even should do.
Well, yeah, I guess that's, yeah, and like that is probably how we should interpret bad faith, as a system that doesn't really provide us with clear. Because, yeah, as I said, as I prefaced in the introduction, bad faith, we are only given examples by the philosopher, Sarge, of bad faith. We're not given examples of what constitutes acting in good or not bad faith. And I guess, like, I bet that's intentional, because then, like, the philosophy would become super complicated, and it would become like, I don't know, moral philosophy, like some utilitarian thing, like about what maximizes happiness or what maximizes wellness or something, or utility. And I don't think that's what bad faith is a claim about. I think it almost seems like, it's more like a thing that we need to recognize about ourselves, that this is just like in our nature. It's in our nature to sometimes forget about the things that we are doing, and forget that, we actually have the capacity to do things differently. Because like, think about, I guess a lot of the time, I don't feel like I'm actually thinking about what I'm doing. It just happens. I've been at uni for so long. Why am I still there? I don't know. It doesn't really feel like a conscious decision. Each essay, it just kind of happens. And like, I guess it'd probably be helpful if I reflected on that a bit more. And maybe maybe that is like how all of this is related to growth. Because maybe upon reflecting on the things that we do, we can maybe have a more clear idea of our motivations or our reasons for doing anything. And I guess that seems pretty important for being a person who cares about stuff. Because I don't really know if it's possible. Even that person, the example of that person in the room who's doing not much, I bet they care about stuff. Maybe at this stage we'll move on to the third part of the talk, which is what comes next? What comes after bad faith? And I guess one question that we've kind of left open is what actually constitutes meaningful growth? I guess before I pass it over to you, I'm just going to say that I don't think we can look at bad faith as, I don't think we can look at the framework of what bad faith represents as something that is actually going to give us clear guidance as to what constitutes meaningful growth. I think it's really only going to tell us what we shouldn't do, and that is be like the waiter, or be like our friend on the date who doesn't move their hand away and doesn't accept their freedom. So maybe after having come this far and we've had so many chats about this philosophy in preparation for this talk, how do you define meaningful growth? Or how do you think we ought to define meaningful growth?
I think for me, like you suggested, it doesn't seem that meaningful growth can only be explained by not doing things. Because I think especially...
As in not freely choosing to do things? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or not, as in, it's not explained only by not living in bad faith.
Yeah.
So, and I think especially with the example we spoke about just before, about the founder of MPavilion, there are instances where, not that she did this unintentionally, but if she did, there are instances in our lives where acting or performing an action in bad faith can actually lead to meaningful growth as well, or provide the opportunity for meaningful growth. For example, us having been to the unis that we went to, even the school that I went to, I didn't get a choice in the school I went to, necessarily. Those things, some of those things, at least some of those things, were probably done in bad faith. But that doesn't preclude the growth or the meaningful growth that could have come from that. And I guess some of that is this talk that we're doing today. I think the talk that we're doing today is necessarily a consequence of at least some actions of bad faith, or some instances of living in bad faith.
And just things that were absolutely outside our control.
No idea.
Yeah, like us even meeting in the first place.
Yeah.
Just, I guess, chance.
Yeah.
Chance, fortune, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when I look at it in that way, I think meaningful growth for me seems to come from a number of different places. And I think it's sometimes difficult, and not only that it's difficult to, I guess, identify where they come from specifically, and that's okay for me. It's okay that there are some moments of bad faith because I know I can, like, looking back on it. So it almost seems, I guess, for me that it's this, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but it's almost like this thing that you can only consider retrospectively. It's hard to...
As in whether or not something has been in bad faith. Yeah.
Or whether I've grown or not.
Yeah.
Right? So I think a lot of the things that we do, for me personally, are meaningful in some way. And I think the example that I really like was when we were sort of doing more philosophy of mind content. We learnt about,
Do you mean at uni?
At uni, yeah. We learnt about, like, the experience of a time traveler. And the time traveler has this strange experience where they can go backwards in time, but also be moving forwards in time at the same time. And for them, and that's in the sense of, I could be going back to 1980 and going backwards in time, but the watch in my pocket is moving forwards. And, this point in the future is continuously moving forwards as well. And I think for me, regardless of whether I'm living in bad faith or not, I guess I've started to look at a lot of the things I'm doing with a sharper lens and to look at, well, am I doing those things in bad faith or not? And then adding this additional, well, does it matter? Is it giving me that subjective meaning in my life? And where it does, and I don't know if Sartre would say that's lazy, I can accept that for what it is. I mean, what about you? What do you think about that?
About meaningful growth?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think before beginning preparation for this talk, I really liked bad faith and the idea that it represented, because I thought it gave me a reason it gave me a clear way of explaining whether or not something I did was authentic or not. And I think that often I would think about meaning as whether I would often say that something was meaningful if I had chosen to do it, if it was actually a consequence of my active decision-making. And I would say that things were less meaningful if, they weren't orchestrated by some of my own personal decision-making. And I think I realized that that is a really weird paradigm, a really weird way of thinking about and relating to the world, because as we said earlier, like we wouldn't have met. I guess, in some sense, there was conscious decision-making involved in our meeting. Both of us decided to study the particular degree that we did, and we met. But there wasn't like some decision that like changed the cosmos, that like brought us together or something. And I think that has, I've realized that it's really silly to think about meaning in terms of like authenticity. And I think that,
or only derived from authenticity.
Or only like emerging from like authentic decision making. Because I think that really makes the process of it kind of, I don't know if you can really codify or like taxonomize meaningfulness. And I think that's a pretty strange place, or a pretty strange thing for me to say, given that the objective of this talk was to kind of try and taxonomize meaningfulness and to try and like put it into a box. But this is where like the whole subjectivity thing is so important, because I've realized that a lot of stuff that I find meaningful is just like arbitrary and like random, and I stumble upon by accident. Yeah, and this is actually a cool segue into something that I also wanted to talk about, which is technology, and specifically like algorithms that suggest stuff. Because when I was going to say that like I found stuff that's really meaningful for me in like a random way, a lot of the time it's like the algorithm just like being inside my head and being like, yeah, like watch this, listen to this. And so like I've discovered that I have this like really profound and resonating love for ambient, like Brian Eno music. And it's like really relaxing and whatever. But there was like no conscious decision making, that I was aware of that led me there. It was just like suggested to me. But you know, for like all of the Brian Enos that come out of the algorithm, there are also like infinite like junk. There's like infinite junk. And that's like kind of, yeah, I feel like one weird thing about living online is that like our growth is often dictated, or our time is often curtailed, and our attention is eaten by these different suggestions. So I don't know, like I think that's in answer to your question, I think all of that is the sum of what I think about meaningful growth now. So I guess it still is like, yeah, quite open for me. But I think one thing that is very clear is that I'm not sure growth corresponds with happiness. Yeah. So how do you feel about that? Because I remember, I guess both of us have had challenges with depression in the past. And it seems like fortuitously and coincidentally, now is a good time for both of us. And we've both expressed that, you know, we're feeling more free and more, I don't know, excited than usual or whatever. So yeah, how do you feel? Do you feel that like because of these positive emotional things you're feeling, like you're growing in a way that is like more significant than before? How would you explain that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I definitely don't think that growth, happiness is necessary for growth. I guess you can feel happy that you're growing, but I don't know that in the process of growth that you necessarily need to be happy. And, you know, there were times where, I guess the example we spoke about earlier was, you know, being forced to play an instrument as a kid. You know, that certainly there were times when I was told to go practice the piano. I was not happy at all, right? But now I look back on that and I'm really happy that I was able to do that, you know, because I have now a skill that allows me to release stress, or, you know, allows me to take my mind off the thing that I'm doing right now. And, you know, I could say that, and I would say that my skill on the piano has grown, and I've grown in that aspect of life, despite the unhappiness. And, you know, when I look at the times that I've been, you know, quite depressed, I mean, like I said yesterday, you know, this time in my life is probably the first time in about 10 years or so that I feel this freedom from being a bystander to, you know, being an active participant in my life. And the clarity that I have, and I guess the ability that I have now to deal with so many things, to me signifies the growth that I've been able to experience over the last 10 years. But in that moment, you know, just like the time traveler, there were periods where I felt like I was going backwards frequently. But that clock was always ticking forwards. And it's in the moment of, I guess, peace or contentment that I guess I now have the opportunity to reflect on that.
Yeah, and me too. I think one thing that has certainly changed for the way that I judge or the way I think about whether or not I'm growing or whether or not I'm actually moving through the world in a way that I am happy with or in a way that I understand is whether I think one thing that changes as the years go by, I guess I'm 24 now, and I feel like even in the past 12 months, I've really felt less of a pull towards objective definitions of success. And I think the times where I've been the most depressed have been when I have seen myself in direct, as like existing in a relationship with these like things like career progress, grades, what my parents want me to do, what my friends want me to do, whatever. And I think, an emotional consequence of those things has been that I often feel like I am like this puppet master of myself, but I'm not really myself. I'm just like making these decisions about where I'm going, but I'm never actually experiencing them. One thing that I guess is going to be a challenging thing to talk about because of its complexity and because of its the difficulty to kind of pinpoint what is meaningful about it is meditation and how that has seems to have really chilled both of us out a lot. Do you what insights into yourself have you made in your calmer moments?
Yeah, I think for me it was I think the last 6 months in Melbourne have been almost a deep meditation. I live out obviously in Rowville and not very close to many of my friends and definitely not within the 5 kilometre radius of most of my friends, or all of them. And, that combined with, this year at the start of this year, doing meditation every morning. And it...
You still doing that?
Yeah, and it brought up things for me that I didn't even know sort of were hanging around in the recesses of my mind. Things that I would say impeded upon my subjective experience of growth or my ability to understand the growth that I was having or appreciate it or even understanding or accepting that moment for what it was or, being able to live in not bad faith in moments that I would usually live in bad faith. And I think that has been really helpful by doing through meditation. And even through yoga. I've been doing that now for a little bit, for a couple of years. And, there's a type of yoga called yin yoga where you are in these deep poses for 10, 15 minutes at a time sometimes. And, some of the visions, I guess, that I've had in those moments have been profound and reflective of some, deep traumas that, I've experienced, through life that I didn't even think were impacting the way that I was approaching the world. And deep conditionings that were, I guess, making me live in bad faith as well. So it's allowed me, I guess, access to some of those things that I wouldn't have had access to otherwise. Or rather, I wouldn't have known how to have access to otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my experiences haven't been so vivid or clear, but I think I guess like one of the lessons that I've learned, and I haven't done, a ridiculous amount of meditation or anything. I guess like, yeah, I use like an app and like, I just kind of sit there. And
Still cool.
yeah, it's pretty cool. And like, I just thought that it's pretty ironic that like that example that you gave of the person in the room doing nothing is like the meditative, or like from the outside is the meditative state. And that it is so, yeah, I was going to say the thing that I have learnt, the things that I have learnt are often just come from perspective. And like, I realized that it's possible for my body and mind to feel less bothered by like everything, by like essays, work, like arguments, troubling friendships, like whatever, family stuff. And then like through meditation, you can have, I don't know, space from that and feel, yeah. And then I guess when I return to like the world and all of its suffering or whatever, I remember that it's possible to like exist in a way that is like calm and still and isn't like plagued by like despair and stuff. And like that sounds really serious, but I guess like that's actually my experience. And I think, yeah, I think when I had like great difficulty answering the question of what constitutes meaningful growth for me now, because I think I almost don't want to have an answer to that question, because for me, it's a sign that I've slipped back into like this hyper awareness and hypersensitivity to what I'm doing, and like this, like I become like a panopticon, and I'm just like watching my entire life and like making decisions. Oh, I've got to do this because it's going to have this consequence. And so, yeah, I feel like this, in doing this talk, I've realized that I've got to like trust myself more and trust my, yeah, and just like try and be more okay with being passive, and like almost to try and be more okay with being in bad faith sometimes, with not, because it's exhausting, like constantly trying to like analyze your circumstances and figure out whether or not they're right for you. And yeah, I think that's what I've realized through meditation, that like there is a lot of peace that comes from being calm and not like worried about what's going on. Yeah.
So nice.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I think
Is that it?
that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
Well, yeah.
Thanks
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Oh, thanks for talking to me, Sharp.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Cool.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Sweet.
Hey, all right. Well, hello everyone. We're gonna start again. Sorry about the technical difficulties. So Shav, do you want to open us up by reading out the first question that we were asked, and we'll go from there?
Yeah, sure. So the first question was from Christina, and it was using Shavin's family context and those where many would find themselves in similar circumstances. Would it be an intuitive basis to say then that objective growth generally precedes subjective growth, with subjective growth being somewhat of a luxury for most, or would they run in tandem, i.e., subjective growth from sensory awareness, morality, and consciousness?
All right. So I guess this question uses your family context as the basis. So yeah, what do you think about, like, how much of subjective growth do you think comes from experience and things that are thought through by the individual, and how much do you think comes from things that are imposed upon us by external measures of objective growth? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it seems, using that, I guess specifically going back to the example where it seems as though, we need to have that objective, we need to grow in some of those objective ways in terms of, having a foundation, or, for mum, it was for her remaining an accountant, or it could have been, finding some kind of financial security. It seems as though, those things were important for then achieving some kind of subjective growth, or perhaps having that freedom in order to pursue some of those things that we might have wanted to do, but not necessarily needed to do, I guess. So, when I look at like Sartre's, theory, it does seem, at least in the kind of society we live in now, it does seem that there needs to be, it doesn't have to be your objective like growth that precedes. It could be your lineage, or your family's objective growth that can help you achieve that sense of subjective growth. But in saying that again, looking back at my mum, it's, even though she may have needed to do some of those things, I still do think that she would have she has had an incredible, she's felt an incredible sense of growth. And we speak about it often just from, you know, the person she was and, you know, the person she now is and all the things that she's learned along the way, even though some of those things were not necessarily just the things that she wanted to do. So I think that, you know, some kinds of subjective growth can be somewhat of a luxury or access to them, but I don't think that it precludes you or prevents you, like not having that objective growth first, I don't think has to limit you from experiencing subjective growth. And I think that's, for me, like that's what I felt through, I guess, meditation. And, you know, for Mum, for her, it was, you know, through her faith and, you know, she was still able to, I think you're still able to achieve or to feel that subjective growth, even if you don't have the objective growth that precedes it. But,
yeah, right.
You just have to look at it in a different kind of way.
I think for me, the most helpful way of thinking about which one comes first, objective growth or subjective growth, is by, well, I guess, yeah, I think it's extremely difficult to pin down, because I think a lot of it would be speculation about psychology. And that's probably a really disappointing answer. But I think that a lot of it becomes more clear when we ask the question of risk. So I think, you know, if someone comes from a precarious financial background, subjective growth, or pursuing things that are subjectively configured as being, or subjectively understood as being of importance, might pose more of a risk to the person if they don't come from a place of security. So I guess in that sense, it seems like objective growth can precede subjective growth, because maybe there is some kind of safety, financial safety, in pursuing things that are objectively considered to constitute growth, because they will come with more security and safety. But that's like, that kind of sucks, because I guess I really value subjectivity and individuals configuring their own definitions of what constitutes growth. Okay. I guess in the interest of time, we should probably move on to the second question, which is, what does bad faith look like in lockdown? I think this question is really interesting, because there is like a uniform, at least in Melbourne over the past few months, there has been a uniform restriction on what people can do. And that has impacted both objective and subjective definitions of growth. I guess employment, in a very general sense, has been totally stifled. You know, and then I guess other subjective things like maybe art and stuff, like I have friends who haven't been able to go to their studios, and so growth has been stifled in that way. But I don't know whether any of these things mean that anyone would be acting in bad faith, because by staying indoors, by consciously deciding to stay indoors, you're actually doing a good thing. And if you're doing it, I guess maybe you are acting in bad faith if you are doing it without actually deciding to stay indoors, but you're doing it just because, you know, like you're afraid of the consequences of going outside or something. What do you think, Shav? Briefly.
I think that it's a really, this is a really hard question to answer, because it feels like, you know, many people might feel that they are sort of living in bad faith, maybe not pursuing the things that they could otherwise be doing. But I think for me, I actually don't know how I would apply it to lockdown, to be honest, in a meaningful way, because the constraints that have been placed upon us are not necessarily ones where we're not choosing to, you know, it's not like we have this freedom to choose to pursue our own desires and we're using our freedom to choose not to do it. We actually don't have that freedom at the moment, and in a very real sense, perhaps even in a more real sense than, I don't know, like a migrant family, or in the same sense as well as that, actually. So I think that we don't have that freedom at all, even to choose not to do it. So I'm not sure. I perhaps what living in bad faith then might be, hey, given that that freedom doesn't exist, maybe what we choose to spend our time doing with the freedom that we have.
Cool. Okay. Let's go to question 4, because I think that's a really, really big one.
Yeah.
How do you feel when you feel like you were growing? And I guess we'll try and answer this from how both Shav and I how Shav and I actually feel when we're growing. So maybe I'll start. I think the perplexing thing about growth is that, at least for me, the perplexing thing about growth is that I often realize that things have changed way after the fact. So it always seems to happen in retrospect. I kind of acknowledge that something has changed a lot later down the track. And that's kind of sad, because I think as an anxious person, I'm constantly kind of monitoring how everything's going in my life, whether I'm happy with this or not happy with some things. And I think I rarely am able to kind of step back and say, yeah, cool, right now things are going really well. I think it always happens. It always happens with me being like, okay, the past few months have been tough. But, you know, compared to the months before that, there's been some improvement. So I actually don't really think that there is any kind of present feeling of growth for me. I don't think it's something that I embody as it's happening. I think it is always a kind of reflective thing. What about you, Shav?
Yeah, I'd say the same. I think growth, like subjective growth, at least in that sense, feels like a really, you know, something you do only find or see in yourself upon reflection, or perhaps it might be when I'm faced with a similar circumstance and I act in a better way than I thought I acted the first time, because I've learned maybe a couple of new things. But I think this is where some of these objective measures of growth can be really helpful as well. You know, if you can lean into some of these measures, and, you know, you can find a way in, you know, you're happy with their place in your life. You know, you could measure your growth in the sense of, you know, going from a D at English at school to an A. And that's a really tangible way to measure growth as well.
What does that feel like, though? What would that feel like? Because is there, like, I don't know if there's, I guess, like, the only kind of feeling I have when, like, I get a good grade or something is like relief that I haven't got a bad grade. But I'm not sure I've ever been like, haha, like, I am growing.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I wonder if it, you know, it has something to do with the amount of effort you might have put in something, or, I mean, for me personally, like right now, I feel like, you know, over the last year, I've had a lot of subjective growth looking back on the year. And if I want to say how it feels for me, it feels nice. You know, looking back, it feels like, you know, I feel like, you know, because of that, you know, whatever situation that I come into in the next however long, you know, I'll be able to handle, you know, similar situations sort of I've experienced in the past in a more, I guess, meaningful way for me.
Have you ever, like, because I guess what you said there were like two different kinds of feelings. There was like the retrospective feeling where you're like, sick, things are going really well, I've transformed a lot, I've changed a lot. And then there's kind of like the prospective like thought that, like, okay, now I'm equipped with, now that I've grown, I'll be better suited to circumstances. But what does it feel like right now in like the kind of liminal limbo phase when you're between these two things? Is there actually a feeling, or is that just like consciousness?
Yeah. I think if I look for a feeling, I don't think I know. I actually don't think I feel like actual growth in that sense. Like in the moment, like second by second, I wouldn't feel the, I don't feel the stopwatch in my pocket, the clock ticking over. I don't actually feel that. It's really only when I take the clock out and I'm like, oh, look how far we've come. Or because I think in the moment, the experience is not always exactly what I'm doing right now, right? There's these things that have happened in the past, things that I'm looking forward in the future. It doesn't feel like I'm always even living like right in that moment either. So I don't, maybe that's where the answer is. Maybe I don't live enough in the moment to pay attention to what that feels like.
Yeah, and I think another like really confusing thing about trying to be present in the moment is that often when I feel the most present, I feel nothing. Like I feel like being present for me often is the experience of being like almost feels like being absent. It feels like this kind of amazing stillness. And so, yeah, I think it is really hard. Maybe like conceiving growth, maybe conceiving of growth, understanding growth is something that can really only happen retrospectively. Maybe it is something that can only be done when you reflect on how you think you were at a particular time and how you think you were before or after that, and whether there's any difference. And then you kind of apply these like various lenses to the various stages of your life. And I guess each lens corresponds to some kind of measure of growth that you have. But yeah, then I don't know. I still think, yeah, I guess one question that I feel like we haven't really spoken about yet and that we won't really be able to answer now. But I guess one thing for everyone to think about is trying to make sure that reflective growth is also occurs alongside prospective growth, where you kind of where there's like a hopefulness that you will become someone different or you will experience new things. And I think that has been something that I've really tried to work on over the years, trying to not so much brood and think about the past, but to try and envision different futures that I could experience or something. Yeah, I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, I think for me, like I'm never sure. I mean, how much conscious control I really have over the things I do anyway, in terms of, real decisive um, control. So for me, that kind of growth is like, it's really nice for me to like view growth in that way, because what it means for me is that in those moments in the future where I may not be, in incredible conscious control, or completely in control of everything that I do, I'll act in a way that signifies that, or like highlights that growth, or highlights some of the things that I've learned in the past.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that's pretty good. I think we're pretty done. So thank you everyone for coming and watching. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
If you have any questions, any more questions that you were too shy to ask, either me or Shav, I'm sure you'll be able to find our contact details on the M Pavilion website. Otherwise, have a nice Saturday. Or if it's not a Saturday when you're watching, have a nice day.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks. See ya.